So good evening. I'm Sarah Copeland-Hansis. I am Vermont's Secretary of State, and I want to thank you so much for being here tonight. We have a small but mighty group here tonight, and we realized, much to our surprise, that it is because there is another opportunity for really great civic engagement happening tonight that it turns out that there were a lot of people who were really interested in. So civic engagement, wherever it happens, is a good thing, and we're happy that you're here with us tonight to talk about the results of our first Civic Health Index, and then we're also so proud if you have to scoot off because you have another civic engagement for the evening. But thank you so much for being here. I am here with our Director of Civic Engagement, Robin Palmer. We have a couple of other notable folks. Brian Mills is our Chief of Staff in the office. And Ethan Schmidt was one of our civics interns this past summer. We had our first round of civics interns, and Ethan and his counterpart went all over the state tabling at fairs and festivals and ball games, helping Vermonters understand how to register to vote, how to check their voter registration, and how to find their voter guide so that they could all be engaged in the 2024 elections. And I think, I'd like to think that we had a small part in the very strong, close to record turnout that Vermont had in the 2024 election. So good job, Ethan. You want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I feel tempted to go on my toes, but I know that's probably not what I should be doing. So we're really excited to be here tonight. This project came about early on in my role in the Secretary of State's office. I got hired almost 2 years ago, which feels a little crazy. I'm still trying to say I'm new, but I'm going to have to give that up eventually. And with my focus on civic engagement in the office, we really wanted to have a sense of like, how are we doing, and where do there need to be improvements, and where are we doing well in one area, and that we can share that with other areas. So we realized that this report structure exists. There's a national organization called the National Conference on Citizenship that holds a data set that helps states answer these questions, and we are the 37th state that has done this. So you can see, it's been around for quite some time now, but we're really excited to bring the first one to Vermont. And we brought a lot of partners together for this work. It was not something we did on our own. And yeah, the main ones, I can even go back to the first slide. We worked closely with the Center for Rural Studies at the University of Vermont, with the AmeriCorps group, Serve Vermont, that funds AmeriCorps programming in Vermont, Vermont Humanities, and an organization called Up for Learning that you'll hear a little bit more about in a few slides. So yeah, we're just really grateful for all of the participation. And one of the first things we did when we brought the groups together was to ask people to define civic health.
So I really love this slide because there are so many different facets and so many different ways that someone might look at civic health and really think about civic health. The bottom in bold is what the National Conference on Citizenship defines as civic health. But some of our other Vermont-based organizations have some other really beautiful things to say about it, such as high level of trust in neighbors, institutions, and selves, trust, belonging, and ownership, feeling that you have the skills required to engage in constructive dialogue, understanding how the systems of power work, right? This is one that's so important to so many people who feel frustrated because sometimes they feel like their government doesn't understand them or isn't listening to them. A lack of understanding about how those levers of power work can certainly contribute to that. And then when people in the community feel that their systems work for them and that they are reflected in those systems. So that's a beautiful and broad set of definitions of civic health, and one that I hope you'll engage with as we go through the rest of the presentation.
So in asking that question of folks, it helped us shape this 6 domains of Vermont Civic Health. And some of those have a lot of what we called indicators, like pieces of data where we could compare ourselves to other states and see how we're doing. So in like volunteerism and donating, or under political engagement would include like voter turnout and things that are very tangible and easy to measure. But in having those conversations, some of the things that came up a lot around media trust and access, government trust and access, sense of belonging, which we put under social and community context, those are a little bit harder to measure and didn't necessarily come as part of this national data set package that we received. And so those are some of the areas where we have more questions that we hope to answer the next time, but we also didn't want to leave those out of this conversation just because some of those things are harder to measure. And so you'll see as we go through, we're just going to touch on each of the 6 domains here and tell you some of the top level findings. There's obviously a lot more in the full report if you want to read it, but yeah, I just think it's like important to mention that we recognize that there could be like a 40-page report or a 400-page report written about every single one of these domains. And so this is really just the beginning of a conversation and why having events like tonight is so important to us moving forward. The other thing that we really wanted to include in our report that's different than a lot of other states was more of a youth lens. And so I'll let Sarah tell you about that.
Yeah, so it was really important to me that we spend some time thinking about how are young people doing in terms of their civic engagement. You know, we know that Vermont is an aging demographic. We see in many of our communities across the state, particularly in our rural communities, that you know, the people who are serving on the select board or are serving in other municipal government positions tend to be on the older side, right? And so it's worth talking about, thinking about, and challenging ourselves to really look at civic engagement and youth understanding and thought about how we organize ourselves civically. And so we engaged in surveying 2,400 students in grades 7 through 12. We had such great response from just those basic surveys with a civic health survey. But then Up for Learning was able to bring a focus group of around 50 students from half a dozen different high schools together to really take a look at that survey data and ground truth it to some extent. And so what we're doing in these community engagement sessions is, you know, we're presenting the whole report, and this is meant to be ground truthing with you so that you can give feedback and ask questions and give us your reactions. And I just wanted you to know that we have done that with youth, and some of the data that came out of that is, I think, really illuminating in the report.
So the first domain, volunteerism and donating, some high-level findings. Vermont ranks 5th in the country in informal helping, and we ranked 13th in formal volunteerism. We also ranked 2nd in the country for donating to political organizations. So this was really not a surprise from all of the feedback we got from our partners, where a lot of people were saying, you know, with flood recovery efforts and different mutual aid things that sprung up around the pandemic and then also continuing through the floods, some of the language of volunteerism doesn't necessarily resonate with Vermonters. Like, they might not consider themselves a volunteer in the sense that you think of like showing up at after-school program every Wednesday or something, but they are helping each other a lot. And so the fact that we ranked higher in informal helping was interesting. And then there's a whole nother dynamic of volunteering related to municipal government and all of the committees and roles that we ask people to take on a volunteer basis. And that's where one of our questions for the next time we do this report really lies, knowing that Vermont relies on that so much and trying to understand, like, who is able to volunteer themselves for those roles, who feels prohibited from volunteering for those roles, and why, and how can we make it more accessible. One other piece from volunteering is we were able to break it down by demographic, and so you can see youth are volunteering at a really high rate, and that's probably because there's embedded either requirements or opportunities that are made available for them to do that. And then through all of the adult demographics, it continues to rise as age rises, as income rises, and as educational attainment rises. So again, not necessarily a huge surprise, but important to know when we're thinking about designing opportunities for people and trying to make them more accessible.
So one of the other themes that you'll see throughout this presentation, and if you take a copy of the report with you or the executive summary, is that Vermont comes through with very high rankings, first, second, third in the nation. But when you look at the percentage of Vermonters who actually responded positively to any particular question, we can see that there's a lot of room for improvement. So we rank second for attending a public meeting, which probably isn't surprising since many of our smaller communities continue to have a town meeting style of local government. However, only 17.4% of Vermonters responded that they have been to a public meeting. So thank you. You're in that 17%. Good job. We also are second in the country in terms of contacting a public official, but still it's only 18%. And before I became Secretary of State, I spent 18 years as a state representative for 3 small towns in eastern Orange County. And when I think about the number of interactions that I had, it was, in line at the grocery store or on the sidelines of a ball game or after church on Sunday morning. And so this number could possibly be quite a bit higher, but people aren't necessarily thinking of running into their state rep and chatting them up at the grocery store as being contacting a public official. Although I can tell you they very routinely gave me questions that I needed to follow up on, so I felt like I was working. I think it's great to take a look at 40 years of voter turnout when we think about political engagement. The top line in blue is presidential elections, which despite the fact that we're electing someone who is even further away from our immediate day-to-day life than our local or state officials, it tends to get the most attention and tends to bring people to the polls in higher numbers. And if you were to pencil in 2024, you would see that it would be right about at the same level of voter turnout, around 72, 73% as we had in 2020. And so we're pulling in pretty strong numbers, but again, that drop-off in the midterms is worrisome. And then if we were to chart on this graph the people's participation in municipal or school budget votes, it would be very close to the bottom quarter of that graph. So, when we think about civic engagement and civic health, the decisions that are made at your municipal level and at your school board level have a much greater impact on you and your wallet and your and the health and strength of your community. And yet those are times when people tend to participate less. Is this one yours?
I can do it.
Okay, go right.
One other piece for political engagement was this question that we asked on the Youth Civic Health Survey, and this was actually one of the biggest kind of areas of concern, is that when you become eligible to vote, do you intend to do that? And 36% of students said no, which felt very high to us. And so that's definitely something that will continue to guide my work moving forward. And I think many of them might end up getting registered because they don't know that we have automatic voter registration when they get their driver's license, but it would also speak to turnout. And Vermont has also been lower than the national average in terms of youth voter turnout, and so that's something that we definitely want to keep on our radar. In terms of social and community context, this is a big domain, again, like there could be a much larger report on this, but we did score high again second. We're not first in anything, but we're second in many things. We ranked second in working with neighbors to do something positive for the community, and also in discussing political, social, or local issues with neighbors. And I think, one of the things that came up for us here as a question for next time was, what's the quality of those discussions? Like, are these two people who disagree having a thoughtful conversation that's like getting to the crux of fixing a problem? Or is it like two people venting at the mailbox about the state of the world? And, so those are some things that this data doesn't tell us, and that's really why we are wanting to talk more to everyone on the ground and understand that a bit better. The other piece around social and community context is that piece of belonging. And we don't have national data for that, but we were able to look at some data from the Vermont Wellbeing Study that the Center for Rural Studies does at UVM. All of this feels a little bit like word salad, but they asked this question of Vermonters: if you ever feel uncomfortable or out of place in your community because of your ethnicity, your race, your language, your skin color, your accent, your gender, your sexual orientation, or your religion. And more people feel comfortable in 2020 than they did in 2013. It went up to 78% of people saying they never felt uncomfortable, but that's still 22% of people, almost a quarter of our state, saying that they do feel uncomfortable at some point due to one of those things. And so that's another big takeaway for us to think about in terms of, we want to encourage participation, but we also need to make sure that we're welcoming it. The last piece for social and community context that was from the youth survey that we thought was uplifting in that regard was that, I can't read the number from here, 82% of youth said that they have spent time with someone of a different background than them in the last month. And we think that that's probably higher for youth than it is for adults in Vermont, and something that we saw as moving in the right direction.
So the next domain is cultural access and engagement. And so nearly twice as many Vermonters reported belonging to any type of civic or religious or other group than the U.S. population overall. So that's 33% for Vermont compared with 17% for the United States average. And we can think about all of the different places that people are involved in organizations, and we actually would love to have your input on helping us understand where people in your community tend to come together and engage. And so you'll see that there's a sheet of paper here that says resources, and there are pens sitting in front of it. So when we do some breakouts later and when we have time to have some snacks, I hope that you will list a few community resources, places that folks in this area can engage with one another. In 2024, 70% of Vermont youth in public school reported affiliation with some sort of group or organization in their community, which is a much higher percentage than adults. And so that makes sense, right? We have youth recreational sports, and we have theater and activities that bring youth together. And I think it's worth challenging ourselves to think about, why don't grown-ups need that? Right? Why don't we have a more robust space for grown-ups to engage? So the 2024 Vermonter poll, 93% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that opportunities to view arts and culture are an important part of thriving communities. If you can get 93% of people to agree on anything, that's pretty amazing, right? However, unfortunately, Vermonters saw a decrease in satisfaction in their access to some of these artistic, cultural, recreational, and learning opportunities. That could be because of the pandemic. I think we can all think of things that we did, cultural events that stopped happening during the pandemic that simply haven't been able to come back together again. We had a wonderful conversation with the folks at this meeting when we were in Brattleboro, and they were talking about trying to figure out ways to empower different groups in the community to revive some of these arts and cultural opportunities, and to help empower different groups of people to step up and lead, because many of the people who were leading these events before the pandemic haven't come back to those mainly volunteer opportunities. Do you want to do media trust and access? Sure. Okay.
Well, I was also just going to quickly give a shout out for our
yes.
comic. So our office worked with Vermont Humanities to create a comic book that hopefully many of you are already familiar with, called Freedom and Unity, a graphic guide to civics and democracy in Vermont. There's a bunch of them on the back table if you haven't seen it before. But it was coming into this role and having this resource to share with people has been so valuable because it's fun and it's artistic and it's engaging, and going out to our tabling events and having things that look fun and welcoming has just made my job easier and more fun for me. And I was just going to give a shout out to Dan Knott, who is the artist that we've been working with, and he also drew all of the the graphics that we're using in our PowerPoint. And so even from our standpoint, where, we're state government, we're not known for being fun and and artsy, but we're trying our best over here. And I think
with some really good help.
yeah, with some really talented help. And it's just brought so much more to our civic engagement efforts. Media trust and access. Here we are, second again, in terms of how often people read, listen to the news about, and specifically news about political, societal, or local issues. Interestingly, Vermonters were about 50-50 if they preferred national news to local news. And so there wasn't like a big aha moment there, except that it seems to be about split. And there's, in the report, that's broken down a bit more, but there was not any like major takeaway there for us. And then the other thing with media trust and access that was interesting was on the youth survey, a lot of youth said that they do not post political or social issue stuff. And for all of the talk about young people being chronically online and always scrolling on their phones, the young people we talked to said, like, well, we might take in information that way, but we know that it's not always like that the sources can be questionable, so we don't want to repost it and be part of that problem. And that seemed to be something that a lot of the young people we talked to took really seriously.
So this is, there's a lot of numbers on this page, but I think it's interesting to come back to remember in your mind the conversation we were having a few slides ago about people's willingness to engage in voting locally versus voting for midterm elections versus voting in those federal elections where we're also voting for president. Because interestingly enough, the percentage of Vermonters with no confidence in their national government is, current, well, as of 2020, it was around 50%. Percentage of Vermonters with no confidence in local government was much lower. And percentage of Vermonters who agree that with the statement, corruption is widespread throughout government in my community, is also quite low. So while people's motivation to vote in some of those national elections is relatively high, it doesn't track with a confidence in the outcome, which I found to be a bit fascinating. So we have come to the end of this first Civic Health Index. These community engagement sessions that we're having are an important part of this process, where we will get feedback from you all over the course of this evening, and we'll ask you to give us some other feedback in writing before you leave. But what's next on our agenda? So we know that there's places where we need more data. We need to understand a little more deeply what's going on in some of those areas of civic health. We would love to continue to hold more community conversations. So we've already gotten invitations to many other libraries around the state. We picked some dispersed ones for these first handful of community conversations, but we know we need to do more. We think it's worth considering building civic resource map where folks can see the different ways that they can get involved and connected with the people and organizations in their community. We know that we need to support volunteerism. And when you look at the disparities between communities that have a strong volunteer network and the communities that didn't, when they were impacted by floods in July of 23 and July of 24, there's just a huge difference in terms of the speed with which community can come together to help the people and businesses that were impacted. And so, you know, we need to understand how to exercise that muscle and how to replicate that in other communities in the state so that everyone feels empowered to come together around a crisis like that. Improving access to civic spaces. I mean, this is a beautiful space, and there are so many communities in Vermont that really struggle for free, open, accessible places for groups to come together. There was a group of kids doing yoga in here before we got set up tonight. So, you know, just hats off to Rutland Free Library for this gorgeous spot. But there are certainly other communities around the state that don't have a big gathering space. Expanding civics education is a passion of mine, and Robin has a whole bunch of different projects that are happening in that realm that I'm sure she would love to chat with you about when we have a little time afterward tonight. But civics education is incredibly important because if you don't know how to pull those levers of power in your government, you're going to feel much less invested in your community and probably less hopeful for your future. And so let's do our kids right and make sure they understand how to get involved. And then, of course, investing in arts and culture, very clear data points from Vermonters saying they want more of that.
All right.
All right.
I think.
Yeah, we are ready to shift gears. Okay, so we are going to do panel next?
Yep.
All right. So we have a handful of panelists who are going to come up and join me up here for a little bit of an opportunity to hear their reactions to some of what they've seen and some prompts that we hopefully sent them ahead of time so that they could be thinking about them. So panelists, if you could come up and join me at the table. We'll visit with the panel for probably 15, 20 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity to break into small groups. Ordinarily, we break into groups that correspond with each of the different domains, but there's 6 domains, and that means you might be sitting by yourself. Or with one other person, which doesn't make for a rich discussion. So when we break up into smaller groups, what we'll do is we'll combine a couple of those domains and give you an opportunity to give some reactions and have some conversation with the folks around you on a couple of those different domain areas. And then at the end, we'll come back together for a little report out. We'll have an opportunity to do an exercise that we call dotmocracy. So Robin will hand you each 3 dots, and you'll get a chance to look at the next steps that are written on the easels to the back of the room. And you can use all 3 dots on the one idea that you think is the most important, or you can spread your dots across different next step directives. The only rule is you can't buy somebody else's dots. That's cheating. But look forward to getting that kind of feedback, and it's really fun to see how groups of people come together to coalesce around some of the ideas that are on the next steps. So I will jump down to the table. There you go. Press and hold. Okay. So we're going to have a curious time. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the microphone down first, and then I will hold on to this one so that we can reverse the order that we're asking the panelists questions during the course of this panel discussion. So the first thing that I would love to have each of you do is introduce yourself, say a little bit about the Civic Health Index and civic engagement generally, and how is that relevant to the work that you do?
Thank you, Sarah. Good to see you all. Thank you for having me. My name is Devin Neary. I'm the Executive Director of the Rutland Regional Planning Commission. We serve 27 towns in the Rutland County, minus Pittsfield. Sorry if you're from Pittsfield. You're in a different region. And we really provide broad planning and development support to towns to help them realize and achieve their goals. So Civic Health Index was an interesting read, and frankly, first blush, I was really proud to see where Vermont ranked. You know, I always sort of take these data sets with a grain of salt. We at the Regional Planning Commission are data nerds. Right now we are updating our regional plan, which is an 8-year planning document for the whole region, and we look at data, pore over it. So I know that data is really promising, but Vermont is also a bit of a microcosm, so that can change how that data can be interpreted. But it really speaks to the social and cultural fabric within Vermont and the Rutland region, and that we are neighbors helping neighbors. And for me, that plays out so apparent when responding to these disasters we recently had. Vermont does not have a formal recovery network. It is all neighbors helping neighbors, and that sort of feels like it forms the foundation for what we're talking about today. In terms of my role, we work directly with town government across the county. And for all of you who are aware, that is all volunteer work. And even our smallest towns, so we represent, or we work with places like Rutland City with 16,000 people, all the way down to Little Mount Tabor with 210 people. And each of those communities has dozens of volunteers that fill roles from select board down to dog warden and fence sitter. You know, like, it is broad and historic. And I can tell you what has always struck me in these meetings with select boards is we have a severe demographic issue, and who represents us generally are older white men. And I'm not saying that as a negative way, but it's a fact. And for me, it really, as somebody who's a millennial in a position working with these select boards, I really wonder what does the future hold for these volunteer and governmental roles in Rutland County? And even more closely to home, my own board is 27 members appointed by each town government in the county, and they're largely older. And I often think to myself, like, who is going to be on my board in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? And it's an important thing to keep front of mind and find really tangible ways to encourage that participation and break down the barriers that exist. And there are many, and seeing the sort of data around education, income, and age, it feels like seeing that high bar in the high school, integrating civic engagement into the curriculum is the only way to sort of ensure a future that includes representation across all people, demographic, and ages. So I'll hand it off to Rich, but I am really excited to talk about this more because it really impacts everything that we do.
Thank you, Devin. I'm going to have to learn about the fence sitters later.
Layer of coal.
My name is Rich Clark. I'm a professor of political science at, I've got to get the name right now. I always want to say Castleton University, but it's Vermont State University, Castleton now. So I work with college-age students mostly. I've had a long career, though, working with governments. Prior to coming here, I did a mid-career move to Castleton. I was with the Institute of Government at the University of Georgia, and I did a lot of work with the National Association of Counties. And most Americans get their services, their governmental services, from counties outside of New England, is how our governments are structured. And so working at the local level is near and dear to my heart. And as a political scientist, you know, if you're a biologist, you know what a healthy cell looks like. If you're an ecologist, you know what a healthy ecosystem looks like. As political scientists, we try to recognize what's a healthy community look like. And I think it's just as a biologist will study as a scientist a cell or a living being, we will study communities and try to identify what health looks like and how to maintain health or restore health in communities. And so the civic engagement part is near and dear to me because we're a democracy, and for a democracy to work, it needs a vibrant and engaged public. So working with students is really near and dear to me. We do a lot of work with we're working now with the national study on learning, voting, and engagement to see how engaged our students are in the electoral process. It measures their voting participation. Since 2012, when we joined that, we have increased the level of voting engagement in every election so far. We don't have our data yet for 2024, but we'll see that. And you know, it's still low. It's still low because voting behavior among people under 30, 25 to 18-year-old, is low. But we're increasing it and trying to engage them and finding out how to energize our students to participate, not just in voting, but in their communities more broadly, on campus and beyond. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Kaya Ganguly. I serve an interesting role in this state. So I am the state's director of trauma prevention and resilience development. And my position exists by statute and is based out of the Agency of Human Services. And the statute that created my position pretty much says, if you are in Vermont, I should be doing something to make your life better. Yeah, it's a big job for one person. But when I look at civic health and civic engagement, it forms the basis of what I try to do, which is to make a Vermont that thrives. Because that's how I interpret what I'm supposed to be doing. And being involved in your community and being active and taking power into yourself is an essential part of that, and that's what civic engagement is. This is super relevant to my work because I'm currently working on a project. We had an existing work group in the state that was called the Child and Family Trauma Work Group. That during COVID, you know, everyone was just in disarray, so it fell apart, and I inherited it. And I'm recreating it into something that I call Vermont Thrives. And Thrives is an acronym because in state government, we love our acronyms. But T stands for having Vermont be a trauma-responsive and healing-centered state. H stands for focusing on health equity and access. R stands for resilience. Even though I really don't like the word because it's been overused. I know it's part of my title, but I'm pretty much done with that because I think we're tired of being strong. I is using innovation and being innovative. V is creating vibrant communities and family. E is using equity to gain access for all. And S is looking at our social drivers of health. And that's where this whole piece comes in. Because when you take that idea and you mix it with the Surgeon General's report in the last administration about the critical crisis of loneliness that we have in this country, this is how we start working on that. Is start looking at how do we come together? How do we use our institutions? How do we take responsibility for the face of our world? You know, I'm not an American citizen. I'm a green card holder. I've been here since I was 9 months old. I can't vote. I rely on people around me to do that. I raised 3 daughters who vote, who are civically active, and who all live in Vermont. And I can tell you the last election, my 1-year-old grandson went with his parents to vote because they want to model the behavior. So yeah, civics education, family involvement, these are all critical pieces, and they're things that we can do and change. A really smart man called Timothy Snyder, who's an author, defined the word to be a patriot. And one of the things that he said is a patriot wants the nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. And that's what this is about.
You can keep the microphone,
Okay.
because we're not going to make Devin go first every time. Although you wouldn't mind, right? So what do you think is the biggest challenge for the civic health in Vermont right now?
Well, I think part of it is one of the factors that was identified here, which is the cultural and arts piece. Because I think when you feed creativity and you feed people's souls and you make them read books and engage with each other, that forms a basis. You know, my husband is in theater and does plays and things like that, and those opportunities have dried up so much since COVID, and he misses it. He still engages in it. In fact, he was Scrooge this past year. But it's those pieces and getting our youth involved, you know, and especially understanding what we're not seeing in the data, because I'm a data nerd, and I mine the youth risk behavior survey because it's such important data. And if you look at the demographics of our youth, I'm going to talk Rutland County because we're in Rutland. 18% of our youth identify as people of color. Now think about that statement for a minute. When we're always saying, oh, 9%. They don't feel counted. They don't feel seen. 25% of our youth in Rutland County identify as members of the queer community. When our numbers overarching, which is really adults, we say, oh, 9 to 10%. So how do we reach youth when we don't see them? Not in a way that matters to them, or we're not addressing topics that matter to them. To me, it's also a reason why youth don't stay. If you don't feel like you belong, and that's a huge issue for me, I do a lot of work on belonging, you don't stay.
Same question.
Yes, absolutely.
I think one of our greatest threats is the loss of a lot of local journalism. And we have these programs now. I think UVM has taken a lead looking at the community journalist studies. But there's a great book at The Increasingly United States, and he documents how so much of our political discussion now focuses at the national level, right? There's a competing event today, people flocking to talk with Becca Ballant, Sanders, and Welch, and that's terrific that they're doing that. But the idea is that, I think you said it at the outset, we can make a bigger difference and a more meaningful difference to ourselves and our neighbors working in our local communities. And we're losing that, and in part, when it's not being covered, what's not being seen isn't being recognized as opportunities for our students and for our younger people, and it's not being overseen in the way local citizens should be engaging with their government. And, you know, I love that story you told that as a representative, people would speak to you in the supermarket. When we don't know anymore who's on the school board, we're in the supermarket lines with them, and we're not engaging at that level, at a very human level, when we possibly could.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's great, Rich. I really appreciate that. That hits home. When starting our regional plan update, we wanted to produce a really broad survey and get a sort of finger on the pulse as to what were the priorities for folks in the Rutland region. And the number one question we went into sort of our public engagement with is, why does this matter to you? And cutting through the noise of a modern life is really challenging. There's so many other things happening, so many pressures, so many competing interests for people's time and emotional capacity, that adding on to that with getting involved, joining a select board, a planning commission, volunteering seems overwhelming. And being able to sort of translate why this is important and why you can have a role in that, I think comes down a lot to education, and why I appreciate your efforts in educating folks in your time as Secretary of State, because more than ever with the national discourse, I think people are sort of like, it's all negative, I don't want to be involved, and I don't want to even learn about it. And that is trickling down into the local level, and we see it play out on social media and all the rest. So to me, I think the challenge is, how do we reach these reach folks, sort of convey why all of this is important, and then addressing the barriers to get them involved, in which, as we spoke earlier, there are many.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to ask my favorite question next, and this is one that probably won't surprise you, because we did a lot more in trying to analyze civic involvement of youth. But how can Vermont, or how can you imagine in the work that you're doing, helping to engage youth?
I think it is the easiest potential pathway, because they're all concentrated in little boxes we call schools. And that seems like a huge opportunity. And like I said earlier, integrating civic education into the base level curriculum is the way. You know, I've seen there's many opportunities, or there have been sort of some attempts to sort of do a token young person on a board, and oftentimes that fails because they're not empowered with any sort of jurisdiction or ability to do anything. They're just sort of there at the tail end. And that could be one opportunity, as well as to actually promote and empower folks to be on boards and places of leadership to make actually some important decision making.
Yes.
We're going to have to leave for that other civic event.
Yes.
And the only thing I came for tonight really was to ask you, how can we do that? Can the legislature just state that civics education must be, by the time our kids graduate from high school,
They must have a certain amount of civic understanding, yes, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So curriculum is decided more at the local level. I think the State Board of Education currently has the ability to say these are the standards that schools must teach to. What I'm noticing as I'm engaging with teachers, though, is that so many of the teachers in our classrooms now didn't have a solid civics foundation when they were students. And so we're making a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy, and pretty soon, we have people who don't have a strong sense of civics. The other thing that I think we need to be really careful to hold space for is that some people suggest that civics is teaching politics, and that we don't want politics in our schools. You know, our schools have to be apolitical.
well, you know what, here's another idea then. I help teach at Bennington Museum in the summer. They have a summer teachers institute.
Oh, wonderful.
They have a summer teachers institute for teachers to get graduate credit on how to
Beautiful. I love that.
Do you know
Because what they're teaching is how to use museum artifacts.
Sure.
So are you saying I personally need to contact the Bennington Rutland Superintendent's office?
You should, for sure, yes, yes.
Can I say though, too, just following up, and we put students on the boards, we don't empower them and such. You would never teach a student to drive without letting them get behind the wheel, right? We do not let students practice democracy, we talk at them about democracy. And I think part of the problem, I'm all for civic education, that's my bread and butter, right? That's how I collect my paycheck for that. But there's a great book out there by John Hobling and Sunshine Hilligus called Making Young Voters.
Yep.
And one of the conclusions they come away with is that teaching civic education is kind of necessary but not sufficient for increasing political participation. That students need to, there are other barriers there.
There's another piece to that too that we do really well in Vermont, but we don't advertise really well. Which was, and I know because I was involved in it, but 2 years ago, the legislature passed, we have a statewide youth
council.
advisory council.
Yes, we do.
And I was
That
involved.
came through my committee.
It was amazing. And I was involved in recruiting students and then applications. We had a 3-week application window the first round. We had 190 applications.
That's beautiful.
And we had to narrow it down to 28 people. It was excruciating. Kids are active, and I can tell you here in your own county, here's an example. Your Restorative Justice Council, which, okay, I'm going to be honest, conflict, my youngest daughter is the executive director. But they have a board, and they had a youth member who was active, and they so valued her input. The minute she turned 18, that board made a unanimous vote and turned her into a voting member.
Nice.
Because they nurtured her and let her see what it was to be involved in a board. So part of it is our fault. We need to trust our youth. We need to give them those experiences because they're showing us they want them.
If I could just add one more thing, it's just the, when we sell higher education, we should be selling it as a public good when we sell it broadly, but when we sell it to students, we constantly sell it as this personal good. You're going to get a better job, you're going to do this. And in fact, that kind of works. Sadly, it works to the extent that we've forgotten about the public good. But when we sell civic education, we should also sell it as a personal good.
Yeah.
It's good for you.
Right.
It makes you happier. Loneliness is killing people.
Yes.
Loneliness is building cynicism, and people who become engaged they're happier. We get better health outcomes. We get better networking opportunities. You know this. You see this all the time. Yeah. And so we should start selling this as a personal good to the youth.
Yes.
And a good to your community. I watched a generation of kids grow up with my children. And we got a great example sitting here in this room right now, Miss Bianca Zanella, who started and has created this incredible poetry program that happens in Rutland every year, where local people have their poetry, submit it, and they show up on store windows. So it's definitely doable.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of, I think, us adults actually letting go of the reins and letting them do some of the stuff.
It's worth pointing out that we do have one community in the state that has proactively chosen to invite 16 and 17-year-olds to register and vote in local elections. That is another way of sort of putting your money where your mouth is in terms of valuing youth voices. What that means is that 16 and 17-year-olds can not only vote for their local select board and on their local municipal issues, but they can run for office as well. And they can serve on those boards as voting members because Brattleboro changed their charter. So there are models out there. The rationale that was used when Brattleboro brought that idea to us in the legislature was that they said, we don't want a person's first opportunity to vote to come during the biggest transition of their life, when they're maybe going through their senior year in high school, maybe they're going to get a job for the first time, maybe they're moving into an apartment or they're going away to college. These are times of huge transition where you can reasonably understand why it might slip someone's mind to register and vote. But Brattleboro's rationale was these kids will have grown up voting. It will be something that can be built into their social studies curriculum when they're juniors and seniors in high school. And we hope that that means they will continue to vote into the future. So I look forward to tracking that over time. With Brattleboro last spring, I went down and, or maybe it was summer, I went down to Brattleboro and met with a group of students at the high school and encouraged them to register and vote. And so I'll be curious to see how their turnout is, because as town meeting is coming up, that's the day for Brattleboro youth to get out and vote. So there's hope.
Can I just add to that a little
Yes,
bit?
please.
One thing I've thought about a lot is, in working throughout the region, I can't tell you how many select board members say they've been on the job for 30 years, 40 years. And it would be so incredible to capture that institutional knowledge and allow some younger folks to shadow and actually see what it's like to be a cook in the kitchen and make the sausage, because I feel like it will break down that sort of facade that it's like, oh, that's somebody else's role. But it's like, no, that person might have started when they were 22 as well,
Yeah.
40 years ago. It feels like we'll miss out on that opportunity the longer we wait.
Mm-hmm, for sure. So I'm just curious if each of you have thoughts on a segment of your community that you wish was more civically engaged. Now, we've talked a lot about youth, so if you want to talk more about youth, please do. But are there other folks who you think should be more engaged civically in your community?
Since I'm holding, I'll go first. It's me. It's millennials. That bar says it all. The 30s, and rightfully so, people are buying homes and they're having their children and their lives are busier than ever in that sort of age group. But also, that age group is making up the largest portion of people in Vermont now, and it feels like that is the time those people who are sort of in the throes of their lives need to be engaged, and they're the lowest bar for a reason. And I am constantly badgering folks, my peers, of being like, this is your chance, get involved. It's so easy, do it now. But it's, again, they can't get past that. So me, it would be the 30 to 40-year-old folks, or mid-20s, whatever it is.
And I'll come back to youth because that's who I'm working with. I would love to see everybody more engaged, but I'd love to see older residents, the retired, the people who are spending the time next on town meeting day in the polling places, reaching out more and engaging with youth, inviting them in, making room and making true invitations that across generations, rather than just focus on one generation, working across generations and having youth invited in and brought in by the people who are already at the table, I think it is really, so it's everybody pulling together, right, and moving in the same direction.
I like that.
I'm going to go off of you because, yes, and I focus on youth because so much of my career has been in youth, and I am passionate about what they can do. But I'm going to broaden it and say I want to see families involved civically.
Yeah.
Because when I've seen the power of when my daughter takes both my grandsons to vote, and God, it would be great for him to get they get an I vote sticker. Wouldn't it be great to get a sticker I went with to vote?
Yeah.
He sits there, he brings a piece of paper, and he writes stuff down.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things we can do that don't cost money or a lot of money, but that would make voting and being engaged a lower bar. Because like you're talking about those parents, okay? If towns had a grant and invested in childcare so that a parent could get involved in some of these evening meetings, knowing that their children were in the next room and they were safe for an hour.
Yeah.
It's not a large amount of money, it's not a large amount of time. There are so many innovative things we could do
Right.
that we're not doing.
Yes, because quite possibly 40 years ago, when one of your board members was starting on the select board, they may have had a spouse who was home with the children.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
with most families, the vast majority with two working parents, it becomes a different challenge.
I just want to add, my wife is a teacher at Rutland Town School, and that the school is the polling place for Rutland Town. She brings her fifth grade students down to the polling place every time, and they get that sticker. And you would have thought they won Publishers Clearinghouse. They are so stoked. And I feel like they were, it's like Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. They're like, wow, I get to see what the adults do. And it really fires them up. So I think that there's something there.
In Georgia, they had a program called Kids Vote, and sometimes the kids would, and they would be their own ballot box at the precinct, but they had to go. And the kids shamed parents. In those communities, they actually had an uptick in turnout because kids would shame
kids
parents.
wanted to
Yeah,
vote.
I want to vote because they wanted that sticker. Yeah.
Drag the
Don't
parents.
underestimate the value of a sticker, right?
Yeah.
That's-
Stickers and T-shirts.
Sometimes it doesn't take much to get people engaged. Well, I want to thank you all so much for being on our panel tonight. I think it was a really rich discussion of civic engagement, and I think it probably gave everyone some ideas of things that we might want to work on improving.